My name is Trent Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of the Franklinton Board of Trade. I am very pleased to welcome you to Episode 1 of a podcast series being done to celebrate the 225th birthday of Franklinton, or as we call it, Franklintennial. We will focus the first four episodes on specific time frames of neighborhood history, but we may hear information outside of those time frames. At any point in time, our guests are going to have a lot of stories to share, and we're not going to necessarily worry if it's within those years or not. We just want to hear from them, and the point of this effort is to document amazing stories from our thoroughly informed guests for posterity. So the first four episodes will focus on Episode 1, 1797 to 1913, which was the founding to the first Great Flood. Episode 2 will be 1913 to 1980, which is the flood up to the point where FEMA designated the neighborhood a 100-year floodplain and really sort of just stifled the neighborhood into time for about 25 years. And then we'll talk about 1980 to 2004. 2004 being the time when the flood wall got completed and development was then allowed to happen, and then we'll focus our attention on 2004 to now, and then look into the future, see where we've come and how far we've what kind of success we've achieved. So we want to thank Josh Clark and his team at Jim Fia Productions for recording and producing this, Land Grant for letting us use their high energy space, Jim Sweeney for his editing and directing, and the entire Franklintennial committee for supporting this idea. And I'll be your host, and so I think we're ready to go. So our very first episode begins with 1797, the founding through the 1913 flood, and our guests are Doreen Uhas Saur and Peter Coccia. And so Doreen and Peter, I want to give each of you a chance to just introduce yourselves briefly and tell us who you are, and then we'll dive into a question. So Doreen, why don't you...
But I am a retired teacher. I very rarely use that word, from Columbus schools, teaching at Fort Hays and Indianola Junior High at the time. So it's a 40-year career that also included a lot of international civic education in the very heart of Ukraine and Poland and things that are in the news today. Yeah. But my interest actually is outside of my field of study, which is European history, and that's where my degrees are. But I developed this love of local history in Columbus when I came here as finishing as undergrad and staying through many degrees at Ohio State and living next door to a log cabin in the university area and suddenly having history all around me, which is not something that was so readily available in Cleveland, which had been built over many times. So you could still take a bus downtown and you could really see a whole lot in what's now the Short North and a whole lot in a lot of Columbus that I really grew to love, that I would say is the blue collar end of Columbus. And luckily married a German who is in the, like fourth generation down on the Parsons Avenue, South High area. So you pick up a lot that way. My current work a lot has been with Ohio Historical Society and other places, actually studying deed restrictions and other restrictive covenants and streetcar maps about the fact that Columbus is so highly segregated in its housing and why historically that's happened. And some of that is going into a national network and others will be used locally. And I'm directing 2 grants, one from the Ohio History Fund and one from the Ohio Humanities Fund, that both of them are looking at Greenlawn as a cultural crossroads, in many ways, the Greenlawn Cemetery. And of course, that's such a part of the West Side history. But more specifically into African American burial at Greenlawn. There were stories we just never could quite figure out who's where and why they're there, and answer questions definitively about how things happen. And I think that greater context of having history, looking at national and local policies along with just those little blips you get here and there. Well, it was stopped here and started there. It comes together, and this neighborhood has always been extremely special to me. I remember doing walking tours, probably before you were born, Trent, in this neighborhood. Now that I know what year you were born, I can say that. And I can assure you I was doing them before you were born. So that's why I'm happy to be here and always astounded at the changes, but really hoping that the past is also still observable.
That's great. We are super pleased to have you. Thanks for being here. So, Peter, tell us about yourself.
Okay, well, I am a native of Columbus. Was born mid-century, mid-20th century, and I had a long career in government finance administration. Retired some years ago. My major area of study in college was German language and culture. So I went back to Ohio State and took some German courses in order to get recertified as for teaching. Currently, I teach a German course to adults on Saturday mornings through the Ohio German Language School. But I guess my whole involvement with Franklinton, well, my involvement goes back quite a ways, but the more recent involvement goes back to a luncheon about 4 years ago on Franklinton that I attended. And I was sitting and chatting with my friend Peggy Crea Dye, who was the executive director of Opera Columbus at the time. And I think the title of the luncheon was Franklinton from Bottoms to Boomtown. Mm. And so I was chatting with Peggy, and she said, you know, we're going to be doing an opera about Franklinton. I said, really? And I said, what is it about? And she says, well, it's going to be called The Flood. And she just gave me a really brief overview of it. And I thought, wow, this sounds really interesting. I said, you know, I've got a lot of involvement, a lot of history with the Bottoms, and I always refer to it as the Bottoms.
Sure, yep.
And so she asked me about it, and I said, well, you know, I went to Holy Family Grade School for 8 years. Which is right there. For those of you who don't know, it's right there on. If you drive past through on the 315, you'll pass it all the time. I said I went through Holy Family Grade School for 8 years. My mother, who was an Italian immigrant, she worked at the Florentine restaurant there on West Broad Street that closed about maybe 5 years ago.
So sad.
Oh,
so sad.
It was. And,
I'll agree with that one.
Yeah.
And she was the cook there for, believe it or not, 47 years.
Wow.
Okay. In fact, this year will be the 70th anniversary of her tenure.
Wow.
The beginning of her tenure at the Florentine restaurant, and also the 100th anniversary of her birth. But in any event, so she was there. She was there for 47 years. Well, you can imagine. Now, let me just segue a little bit. I grew up in the Bottoms. Grew up on Avondale for the first 6.5 years of my life. After my parents were divorced, we moved to the Hilltop. My mother and children moved to the Hilltop. But we continued, all the children continued going to Holy Family, either grade school or high school. Yeah. And so we did that. I did it for 8 years. And, of course, you can imagine going to, with your mother being at the Florentine for 47 years, that meant frequent trips into the Bottoms.
You ate a lot of pasta.
A lot of pasta, loved going back, driving around. And, of course, the other big love I had as a child was baseball.
Yeah.
And so that meant playing Little League Baseball in, at that time, Sunshine Park, now Dodge Park. And, of course, going to, back then, Columbus Jets game. Yeah. Which the Columbus baseball franchise was a Pirates farm team. For about 15 years, from 55 to 70. And when I was young, in my early 10, 11, 12, went to a lot of Jet games. Got my Jet badge, we can talk about later. Yeah. But so it was playing baseball, going to, at that time, Jet Stadium, being in school there, walking around the neighborhood. My father continued to live on Avondale. So there was just a lot of involvement with that. So she was very interested in that. And I said, you know what? Have you ever really delved into Franklinton? And she said, no. I said, I'll give you a tour. Mm-hmm. So I actually, met her and took her on a tour of Franklinton. And then she said, well, you need to get involved with the flood. And I did. By way of giving the cast and crew a tour of Franklinton when they arrived for their performances, and also giving a pre-talk lecture for Sunday, the Sunday performance.
Very good. So you clearly have spent quite a lot of time in the neighborhood,
Right.
Lots of history. Really miss the Florentine. So I appreciate you telling that story about your mom. So, Peter, I'm going to keep rolling with you for a minute because we're going to have a little fun with this, and we're going to start at the end. So please tell us what makes March 25th, today's date, so special to begin this podcast series, especially since we're talking about the first period dealing up to the 1913 flood.
Right. Well, Trent, when you said, we're going to do this thing on March 25th, it probably in the back of my mind started thinking March 25th. And yes, then I connected it and said, that is the day all hell broke loose in Franklinton with the floodwaters. Now, the 1913 flood was probably the worst natural disaster that Ohio experienced, and especially, certainly, Franklin County in Columbus, Ohio. Franklinton, and Doreen will probably get into a lot of this, has always been prone to flooding. In fact, I think Lucas Sullivan he noted it right from the beginning when he started building here. And so there were a number of floods over the years in the 19th century. And the one before 1913 was probably the worst one was 1898. But even that paled in comparison to what happened in 1913. I, being at Holy Family in 1959, experienced the 59 flood, which is on record as the second worst flood in Columbus history. Now, we'll start off with the stats so that you at least get a sense of the magnitude of it. As a result of the 1913 flood here in Columbus, there were around 95 people who died. There was street flooding that went from anywhere from 8 to 22 feet of water throughout Franklinton. And we're talking about an area from the Scioto River at the north down to Green Lawn, Central Avenue, to the Scioto River on the east side. 20,000 people were rendered homeless as a result of that flood. Nearly 500 buildings were destroyed, and probably 4,000 homes were either damaged or completely destroyed as a result of that flood. So for around a 4.2 square mile area, it became an inland lake. It became an inland lake.
Wow. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the flood later on. But
can I just mention?
Did you want to mention one more thing? You go.
Well,
right
there's
ahead.
a lot. Yeah, and there's a lot of things about it, a lot of stories. But the other thing, and there's always connections you make, especially when you learn more about the flood and the streets that were impacted and the people. As I parked my car today and walked over here, I walked down Rich Street before I turned down Lucas to head to Land Grant, and I recalled from my research that at around 423 West Rich Street is where the body of a Sergeant William Avery Sexton was found some days after the flood waters receded, and he was involved in rescue attempts.
Yeah,
and so he got into his boat, a very flimsy boat, trying to reach people who were crying for help. The boat tipped over. He drowned. And he became I think maybe the fifth or sixth police officer to die in the line of duty, the first one to drown. But
and you just happened to walk by that address today.
One block directly north of here is the location that has been given as where Sergeant Sexton died.
Wow. Thank you for that story. That's powerful to know that just happened to you earlier today. So Doreen, now I want to have you take us back to the beginning. How did Lucas Sullivan find Franklinton, and what would he have seen when he got here? Tell us what types of benefits or dangers he would have encountered when he arrived, and what made him want to settle it here.
Well, I think it's interesting because I think I can make a connection between what Peter just said and Lucas Sullivan. And it's the fact that if you're traveling on 71 North going to Cleveland, or from Cleveland back to Columbus, you might notice where the watershed divides, and you're really up around Cleveland when suddenly you realize that all the water that falls in the rain to Cleveland, it starts really around Strongsville, close to Cleveland, and that's going to Lake Erie. Everything else in the state is coming our way. And so when you talk about the magnitude of that flood, that is really what Columbus had to deal with the floods. So to make the connection to Lucas Sullivan, one would have thought that the man who is surveying, and this is how he comes into the area, might have noticed that in front of the old Central High School, where he noted that there was corn being grown, that it would have been a floodplain. Wouldn't you have thought that would have been the first thing in his mind? It's good and it's fertile and it's obviously there for a reason, and yet the indigenous tribes are not living on that part of the world. They are living a ways away. So as Peter said, within the first year of founding a town, or at least laying out what he wanted, he already has to move it back to the west, and then he moves it back again and moves it back again. It's a long unfolding story. Sullivan himself, I think the story is pretty well known, is obviously the founder of Franklinton, which becomes the neighborhood that grows Columbus. But I thought I would kind of veer off track a little bit with some of the things we don't know and we do know about him. He is, first of all, there is no West Virginia. So Virginia is right up against the Ohio border, and as Ohio opens after the American Revolution, it is probably the one place that you're going to be able to get land that's considered fairly cheap. And of course, if you're a veteran and you were fighting under Virginia's flag in the American Revolution as a colony of Virginia, you are going to have benefits here, and that's the Virginia Military District, which he is helping to sort of survey out to see exactly what is going to be given to veterans. So he arrives on a mission, and he is very familiar with, of course, having lived in Virginia, and being somewhat of I'm going to say, an orphan himself. He is adopted in a way by a family who are in Kentucky, and that is where he will meet his future wife, Sarah. Except that she's a child. She's a toddler. He's already a young man when he first meets her, and her father becomes his friend and takes him under his wing. His own father essentially abandoned the family and was not there as a role model or a mentor. So he's a very entrepreneurial young man trying to make his way in the world. But he is associated with a slave-owning family on the other side of the Ohio River. So when he takes on the job as surveyor, he has an eye for what he wants. He's going to get his payment in acres. And it's usually quoted that he has about 1,000 acres in the end that he is going to be given, of which then he will promise some of that to secure the idea of Columbus being located on the other bank of the Scioto River. But according to a 1925 report that was done about survey and lands, the Congress land, the U.S. military, the refugee track, and all of that, Lucas Sullivan got more than he probably bargained for. First of all, he was the largest property owner in all of Ohio. At one point, he was credited or viewed with suspicion at having well over 4,100 acres of land on his personal name. Wow. And so it's a huge amount that he has. But if you look a little bit more deeply into it, where we are right now in Franklinton was essentially the epicenter of court contest after court contest. There were disputed things all over the place. There were people who were obviously the refugee track up in Nova Scotia, Canada, kind of in the border. They were selling the land that they were being given because they had no intention of moving here. And knowing Lucas Sullivan, they were essentially waiting for him to help be their advocate in court to make sure that the sale was legal. There were other people who were selling land. There were people buying land. I swear this man has spent more time in court probably solving other people's problems than the average area commissioner in Franklinton spends in meetings thinking, why am I doing all of this? So he was devoted to what he was doing, and he was considered a pretty straight arrow. People trusted him. And so where those numbers come from is a little bit hard to tell. But it is undoubtedly Franklin County, where all these grants come together, is highly disputed court territory, even to this day.
Very interesting.
When the lot's laying out. So his legacies are interesting, and I think in a way his legacy of his sons is probably some of the most important. But I'll stop there because maybe you have a thought about where you'd like to direct the conversation, Trent.
Well, I'll tell you. So one of the things that I really wanted to find out more about is, so his wife's name was Sarah, correct? Lucas's wife was Sarah. And so with this, with March being Women's History Month, why don't we talk about the roles women played in the founding of Franklinton and some of the jobs that they were required to do to make this successful. And I asked that question both because it's Women's History Month, but also because we've had the Carol Stewarts and the Helen Evanses and the Judy Bashams of the neighborhood who have done all these great things. And even today we have a lot of female influence directing the neighborhood. So talk a little bit about what that would have been like back then and how they would have contributed.
Well, it's interesting that we would think about then and now with this, because sometime in the, of course, Lincoln Sullivan is founding this in 1797, so let's just start with sort of around 1800, give it a little running start here. Within an 80-year period of time in which Sullivan's sons are essentially winding down their own careers, or they're very successful, Joseph and William in particular, the role of women and men has vastly changed from when the earlier part of the century would have been the 19th century to the later part of the 19th century. So women come in much more probably as worker bees and definitely as helpmates. And there isn't that gender distinction that we think of later in the 19th century. In fact, there is a huge shift, as if you can think about this for a moment, when is the golden age of men's clubs in the late 19th century? When do women who are any money all of a sudden have to form ladies' societies and hope they're going to work in charity? Because actually they're forbidden before the Civil War of even speaking out on abolition. The role of women is immensely confined near the end of the 19th century, from the mid to really the suffrage starts. So the early women would have been helpmates by all stretches of the imagination. Sarah, coming in as a young woman, as a young bride, probably does have help, and she certainly does, and that will bring up a whole other thing about role of African Americans in early Franklinton. I can talk about a little later. But people like the Deardorff family, of which there are many Deardorffs still around in Columbus today, they are definitely, taking on the full load, along with the children and the housekeeping. They're doing it all too. And I think that's what's interesting about today and women in Franklinton. Because when I think back, and I've been at this a long time, knowing some of these women, I think about Lois Neff, who wrote for the West Side Messenger history. She was not historically trained. Her brother was a principal at West High School, Eugene Bay, and so she was definitely an educated woman. But she did research on her own. People like Susan Metal, long gone, but was doing so much about properties and understanding exactly the lot lines of Franklinton and really contributing a lot of research. People like Brenda Dutton, who still is an actor today, and Leslie Blankenship, who is still with all of this, and of course Carol Stewart. When I think about scholarship happening in Franklinton today, I really see it as happening on the women's side. Not that men have not contributed. All excuses, Trent. I'm excusing you.
I know where you're coming from. Yeah.
But quite honestly, it's the marriage of scholarship with the stories you hear that you can't really prove unless you can find some documentation. That is really what I hope your podcast start to encourage in people, and it's building on women's work. When the statue of Lucas Sullivan down by the riverfront was created, what's interesting is, I am sure because of Leslie and others and Carol, at the base of it was the testimony to women. Mm-hmm. So people might want to stop by that.
Okay.
Salute Lucas if you wish, although he looks a little too much like a Spanish explorer to me to be comfortable. But I always think of Ponce de Leon standing there. But the base, isn't that interesting? It's the base of the statue. Now, does that mean the founding of Franklinton is based on women? I would like to think that's probably what Leslie was trying to signal and Carol were trying to signal. But the stories are there.
Very good. So getting back to the flood period, obviously, one of the things that the flood would have benefited the neighborhood for was the richness of the soil. With all the river silt coming up as often as it did, what kind of crops did they primarily grow here? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I think that's also what's interesting, too, about what we're looking at that was recently proposed by movers and shakers of Columbus, is looking at the rivers that come down north-south that sort of look like ribbons kind of streaming down, on either side, is that we're on a glacial tilt soil. So you're right, it's very rich soil. So, it's corn for the most part, it's maize that's being grown here, lots of the other root vegetables, the squashes and whatnot. And there and getting back to historic research for a moment, what's interesting is also other things that we just don't think about quite as much. When Walt Reiner was trying to deal with the Deerdorf cabin, and he was and working with the city of Columbus around 2012 to try to rehabilitate that structure, and hardline design architects were involved. Charlotte Durst was involved with the archaeological aspects. I had a group of students from East High School that were helping in the coldest January you can imagine, when archaeologists come in from the field, actually working in the basements and whatnot, trying to do some of the sifting through archaeological pieces and things that were already found, is that there were guinea fowl bones that were found. Well, guinea fowl are raised by, they're not chickens down here. That's a Virginia, that's a southern fowl that would have been raised for produce. And there are other samplings of those archaeological remains, of which I think there's too little done down here. And with the amount of development going on down here, there should be a lot more archaeological work before the development sets in.
Yeah, Walt did a significant amount of digging at that site. So
right. And considering, too, that there were odontology excavations being made about the wood in the Deerdorf house, and the Deerdorf family themselves, through family folklore, had said that some of the wood was an original, or maybe a 2-room little cabin, and then added onto later. Finally, that's exactly what was proved with the logs. Not only was there a part of the structure which was far older than everyone thought the Deerdorf house was, but there was even logs that were cut way before that they can't account for. Mm-hmm. And in addition to it, I guess the favorite story is the Spanish doubloon story. They found a Spanish doubloon in the basement of the Deerdorf house, somehow, again, with the pits and whatnot that you're looking at. Mm-hmm. But and as we all looked at it in amazement, and the students at East High and their teacher were looking at this, we were told it was a fake. And so that tells us also something about Franklinton people.
Now, Peter, I know that you had some input in this section of the questioning, so why don't you go ahead and jump in and talk about your thoughts.
Okay, I'll just mention one brief thing about in relationship to your question about the farming. I think it was probably Michael Sullivan, who was the second son of Lucas Sullivan, who had an intense interest in farming and crop development, et cetera. And he, believe it or not, the 1851 Ohio State Fair was held on the grounds that Lucas Sullivan, or that Michael Sullivan owned, and it was just a little bit west of the where the residence was, the Sullivan House.
Wow,
that was 1851, because I think when Lucas Sullivan died, the eldest got the lands north of the Scioto River, and Michael got the lands just south of the Scioto River.
Go ahead.
I was going to. He goes on to Indiana or Illinois.
Illinois,
and is a cattle rancher there.
He becomes
too, right?
a cattle rancher and a very prominent cattle rancher in the country. But then tied to the whole women theme is that obviously mid part of the 19th century, the great event in American history is the Civil War, and there's some interesting history in Franklinton tied to the Civil War. At that time, there was a camp out on the far west side called Camp Chase, and it became the training ground for the Union soldiers, and then eventually, after a couple years, also the prisoner of war camp for the Confederate soldiers. And as a side note, I basically the house that we lived on when we moved to the hilltop is on the grounds where Camp Chase was, but. As often happens with war, Civil War, and with soldiers gathering, there were camp followers. And so there were a number of women who became sort of caught up in this and were abused and abandoned and by soldiers and others. And city fathers at that time, the city council reached out to the Father Fitzpatrick here at St. Patrick Church and said, we hear about this order of nuns called the Sisters of Good Shepherd, and was wondering if it would be possible to bring them here to help minister to this population of young women. And so he worked it so they eventually came. Initially, I think 4 or 5 of them in May of 1865, and then the ministry grew, and as it grew, they needed a bigger place. And then they actually purchased the Lucas Sullivan House in late 1865 or so. And that became their ministry, where they started it through educational programs, through work programs, and it grew over time. I mean, the house the Lucas Sullivan House became embedded in a much larger campus that included dormitories, chapels, kitchens, workspaces, etc. And so it encompassed quite a big of a space, probably from Sandusky Street, which is now 315, over a couple blocks, and then from Broad down to past State Street or so. And the Sisters of Good Shepherd had that ministry there from 1865 until 1964, so almost 100 years. They were part of the sort of the fabric of Franklinton, if you will.
And for people that wouldn't know this specific fact, Lucas Sullivan's house basically was where 315 is today, correct?
It was. It was very much so. I remember I was in the second grade at Holy Family when the heavy machinery came in to dig the ditch or the gully that would then basically be the end of Sandusky Avenue. And the retaining walls were put in place, and then over the next couple of years, the road was put into place. The expressway, Sandusky Expressway, because what they did, they wanted it to go underneath Broad Street.
Yeah.
And so they had to reconstruct the Broad Street Bridge. And at the time, there was a dispatch article back in, I think, the summer of 1957 that said, here's the plan, and said, because of the way the plan is designed, Holy Family and the Convent of the Good Shepherd will not have to relocate. Well, that maybe lasted for a few years, but it basically meant the sort of like the whole change in the culture, if you will, of the time there.
Yeah.
But
For perspective, the way 315 goes under Broad Street, they had to dig all of that out.
Oh, they had to dig all.
Yeah, that was grade level before.
Yeah, you can imagine a 7-year-old.
So a 7-year-old seeing that kind of a hole,
going to the edge, who remembers crossing Sandusky Street to get to school. All of a sudden, now you have fencing going up.
Yeah.
And this huge ditch being dug out, and it was like, wow, this is. I mean, when you're young, you just look at it and you sort of just, are just baffled by it and somewhat maybe mesmerized by it. But it was sort of like, I don't know, it was it meant a big change, I think, for the whole character of Franklinton at that time.
Well, and I think that's when, a lot was really lost that we can't even begin to fathom anymore. Because along with it, there had been a courthouse Franklinton had used that later became a school.
Right.
And I remember Bruce Birch, who's long since passed away, telling me at one point that when the steam shovels essentially started digging out, they hit the basement. The building had been leveled, but they hit the basement of what had been the former courthouse. And in the first scoop that came up, all of a sudden there were these little pieces of paper that started floating down and floating down all around. And people were reaching up to catch them, to grab something. And these were the courthouse records. And they would just dissolve in your hand. Of course, they were so brittle. All of that was gone. There was a Franklinton fort that was built essentially about the same spot, earlier even than that, because the courthouse had been a brick building, and this was truly the log fort, from which people from Dublin would come running down at the first thought if there might be an attack. Remember, before in the War of 1812, there's a period of time in which you don't know which side the indigenous tribes are going to side with, the British or the Americans, and so there's a great deal of fear in the area. And that little fort, of course, at some point there's a dispatch article that it was taken apart. It was large enough, small enough to be able to be taken apart, and it wound up on the Wolf property by the Wigwam in Pickerington, and at which point it seems to have disappeared. So these little traces of history, and not so little, we really can't remember, and you can't put a plaque on everything. And at that point, what good have you done? You kind of walk by and think, the basement of gravity. What was here?
Yeah.
So it's tough.
Yeah,
Change is tough.
It is. When those are lost, they're lost, and it's a shame. So Peter, I want to make sure we get to a certain topic that you and I both love. We both love baseball, and baseball season is upon us. And so you have some great stories about the old Jets Stadium and when the Clippers were the Pirates Farm Club. And so my favorite guy was Willie Stargell, big 70 star of the Pittsburgh Pirates, the We Are Family team. And so tell us a little bit about that, because I know that's something dear to your heart.
Yeah. Well, you're a staunch Pirates fan.
Absolutely.
And I'm a lifelong Yankee fan, so I can hear the booze starting. But when you're a kid, you love baseball. You love baseball. You know, you don't care who's playing. And it was a thrill. And I just loved baseball, and it was a thrill to be able to go to Jet Stadium. And at that time, it was kind of easy. If you got there enough before the game, you could go close to the dugout.
Yeah.
Get autographs.
Yeah, the access back in the day was you could walk up to a player.
Bring a program, get autographs. Ask for a ball, they'd give you a ball, and then you get autographs. So it was very congenial and very warm atmosphere. And so I spent a lot of time at Jet Stadium back in probably the 61, 62, 63, 64 seasons there.
Yeah.
And got to know some of the players, and I still remember this now goes forward a little bit, but when back in 2005, they're still at Franklin County Stadium, or Cooper Stadium as it became known. And Frank Howard was, if you remember Frank Howard, he's a native of Columbus. He went to Columbus South High School and became a big star with the Dodgers, the Los Angeles Dodgers, and the Washington Senators. And so he became the first base coach for the Clippers at that time. Mm-hmm. And they were still the Yankees farm team. And so I went, they allowed the fans to go out onto the field after the game, so I went up to Frank Howard because I remembered him, and especially from the 1963 series. He hit a home run off of Whitey Ford in the fourth game of the series, and which the Dodgers eventually won in 4 games. And so we're chatting a little bit, and when I told him about it, I said, what was the pitch that Whitey Ford threw you that you hit for the home run? It was a towering home run, too. And he kind of smiled and laughed about it.
That's funny.
You could see it brought a sort of a little joy to his face.
And so you brought a little artifact with you. Your pin is from which season again?
This is, I think, from the 1964 season.
64 season.
It's called a jet badge. A jet badge. So as a child, I think you purchased the jet badge for a very small amount, and it basically then gave you access to the games and general admission seating in the games throughout the course of the season. Yeah,
that's great. Yeah, and it's nice to talk about that because the Dispatch just a few days ago did another follow-up article on the condition of Cooper Stadium. So we're awfully anxious in this neighborhood to have that become a productive part of the community again. Yeah. So it's nice to talk about that and hear about how fun it was in the past. So a little artifact that I brought with me today that I showed you guys a little bit earlier is this program from the 1911. Let me hold this up for the camera. We're kind of new to this. There it is right there. This is the program from the 1911 event celebration when what was originally called the West Side Board of Trade, which now I run the Franklinton Board of Trade, but that was a group that was formed in 1904 by businessmen in the community that wanted to elevate the railroad tracks there at Spaghetti Warehouse and Gravity so that they had unfettered access to downtown. And they were successful, and I could only imagine that was a monumental task. And so in 1911, they completed the project, and they had this tremendous celebration. And I showed it to both of you earlier, and just wondered what kind of comments you guys might have about that.
I love the menu.
The menu is to die for. Yes, it is.
Was hysterical. Could you come up with any more things that come out of a river to serve? I think that was the piece and I enjoyed the most. I will live.
And I got that from Bruce Warner. I want to mention that Franklinton legend and historian Bruce Warner gave me that.
Truly the historian, but Peter's comments are probably much more academic than mine.
Well, I don't know academic, but I mean it's the Toledo and Ohio Central Railroad Depot.
Yeah.
And the elevated tracks are right next to it. It's the Pagoda Building. Uh-huh. And when it was designed, and I think Frank Packard, the architect, Frank Packard did the design for it. He was the architect. It was designed to model the look of the Macklin Hotel, which was right next door, which had maybe 4 or 5 pagoda-type towers.
Okay.
And
I see Bruce back there shaking his head. Yes,
Okay,
that's all.
all right.
That's all accurate.
That's
yeah.
good.
Yeah.
That's called immediate fact checking, right? But anyway, so it was designed to. It was modeled after that, and of course, the Macklin Hotel, I think, closed, and it eventually was torn down around 1955, and it's now the parking lot for the spaghetti. Or that space is now
okay,
the
so it was right
parking
there.
lot for the
Okay.
spaghetti warehouse. What you're showing us is a program from 1911, which is actually 2 years before the flood.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And one of the things, when I gave a tour of the of Franklinton to the cast and crew of the flood, one of the places we stopped was at the Toledo and Ohio Central railroad depot, because if you go inside, there's a marker probably about 5 feet from the floor, which shows where the floodwaters crested.
Yeah, to those listening, you can go in the building and they have plaques showing the high water marks, which are pretty astounding when you stand there and look at it.
Yeah, and in fact, I usually like to point out 3 markers for the flood in Franklinton. One's the one inside the Toledo and Ohio Central Station. Another one's at the Dana Avenue School.
That's probably the most shocking one.
It is.
Because that's very tall.
It is.
Very tall.
Because there, I mean, Dana Avenue School which was built probably maybe just a couple years before that. So you have to walk up steps to get to the front doors.
Yeah.
And then once you enter the doors, you have to walk up another set of stairs.
Yeah.
And then there's a marker inside
And then there's
there,
the watermark.
right toward the ceiling.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking that had to be probably close to 20 feet. Can you imagine?
I would imagine.
Can you imagine that amount of water coming through this area?
Yeah.
There's a house on State Street near Hawks Avenue where you can still see the water line. In fact, there's probably a number of houses where they have a water line.
On Hawks near State. Okay.
Yeah, on Hawks near State. Well, it's on State Street right at the corner of State and Hawks.
Okay.
Okay, and you can see a water line to it. And that water line comes up basically to the beginning of the second floor. Mm-hmm. Okay. It just astounds me to think of the water that came through this area in a matter of just a couple days.
Yeah, and Bruce Warner has he has just every picture you could ever imagine,
Right.
and he's shown me so many of guys dragging horses through water that was up to the horse's neck, and there was the one photo he showed me with I believe there was either a cow or a horse inside of a house. Where the guy put his animal inside of his house to save its life, and so the devastation was just incredible. And so we're kind of like bringing it back to the main topic of the 1913 flood. So what other things would you guys want to add about what happened during that?
If I can kind of add this too, because
Yeah.
I look at Peter and Bruce as certainly much more the experts on this, but in Greenlawn, I think what has surprised us the most, and Randy Rogers, who's executive director of Greenlawn Cemetery, and I had done a 1917 flood tour, was not just the volume of the water, but the direction of the water. So that people who come into Greenlawn are used to coming over the Greenlawn Bridge and then coming in over the river that way. And so when you take them back to Brown Road, and you are back there where there's a utility shed that also had a high water mark, and you realize that you're over 20 feet there, that is shocking, because that's high ground,
Yeah.
in most people's heads. And we know that there were stories, we do have pictures of the devastation after the flood in the cemetery, but we also know there were people who, a man who kind of strapped his children to the trees and himself to the trees high up as he could, and they were still lost. There are burials in Greenlawn of just the flood victims, and we know some of the stories
Right.
Of some of the, what I usually call are sort of the heroes and the victims, and also perhaps those who unwittingly contributed to the flood. And it's just a little bit probably harder to sort of imagine. But in some cases, that overpass was part of a contributing factor to the floods at the velocity of the water and the channeling of the water. Because when railroads were coming in, and of course there was nothing over the Scioto at first, and in fact the Chino Railroad Station was President William and Governor McKinley's favorite place to always be photographed. He loved having that as a backdrop, when somebody was following him politically. But the railroads follow the paths of rivers, and this is not just in Columbus, but obviously we have a lot of lowland in that area. And because it was easier than taking out all the trees and whatnot, they're looking for a normal bank. And then you start putting in the essentially culverts, and you're putting in overpasses. And now the water, think about that spaghetti warehouse where you had to go underneath essentially the overpass and you're through the round arches. Well, if you have water coming at a certain velocity, now it's really coming. And I think there was a book that was, done, a lot of things that are done on the 1913 flood really start to mark out that engineering aspect. And it's kind of a horror story as to what happened.
Just the unintended consequences of things like
Absolutely.
that contributed to the devastation.
Yeah.
So some of the stories are just so tragic. I mean, you touched on one, Doreen, about the I mean, when people had to escape, obviously, you know, the call went out, you know, get to higher ground, or, you know, get out of Franklinton. So, you know, if you're lucky, you were able to get to the east into the Columbus, or you got into the hilltop, and a number of people eventually got shelter at the Columbus State Hospital. And if that wasn't possible, then it was a matter of going to the second, as high as you could in your house, on the roof,
Yeah.
or outside, climbing trees. And the one story that was mentioned was there was this, and it was a part of an oral history that was given back in the 1990s, of a man who decided to try to save his family, his wife and his 4 children, by having them up on a tree, and he had a rope that he wanted to tie. And the Tuesday night, March 25th of the flood, a rope that he tied around them. He figured, you know, with the night coming, at least, and it being cold, at least that would just keep them in place. Well, the following morning, they were all in place,
But not alive.
but not alive. Right, not alive. So that was a very tragic thing. Oh, and the stories go on and on. If I can just maybe one other tragic story.
Sure,
here.
good, yeah.
This I came across, and the Dispatch articles from back then are extremely interesting. But you know, I just saw a little snippet as I was doing some research, and it was in the Friday, March 28th. So by Friday, March 28th, the floodwaters had started to recede. Okay, and there was a woman who, it began with a note saying, "A mother wants to know." And it said that a despairing woman of North Glenwood Avenue has appealed to relief workers for news of her daughter, a pupil of the Avondale School. The child went to school Tuesday morning, and her mother came down into the city. Since that time, she has heard nothing of her. The woman, with 50 other refugees, was being cared for at the Southern Hotel and was grateful for any news of her daughter. That was on Friday, so as the floodwaters receded. Monday, a small snippet in the Dispatch said, the little girl, age 9, the daughter of this woman, North Glenwood Avenue, was found dead at the morgue. How the child died, her mother will never know. The mother was east across the river sewing when the water came. She had left her dinner in the kitchen at the home. The water must have swept through when the child went home at noon. The body was found at Green Lawn Cemetery, miles south. So this was the apartment was on North Glenwood Avenue, and I think we all have for those of us familiar with Franklinton, sort of know that stretch. It's a small stretch before you get to the railroad.
That's a chilling reality that she was found that far away.
Can you imagine a child got swept away at that point and was carried many miles all the way to Green Lawn Cemetery?
Wow.
Very tragic story.
Well, we are so grateful for you both coming here and sharing your depth of knowledge with us. We could probably talk for another 4 hours and still not run out of things to say. But I kind of want to conclude this by, asking both of you what Franklinton is today. What kind of thoughts and comments do you think Sarah and Lucas would have about what we have in this community today?
I'm going to let you go first.
You're going to let me go first? Well, I think Lucas and Sarah would probably say that the people who live in Franklinton have persevered.
We toughed it out.
They've toughed it out.
Yeah.
And it has that character and reputation of being just a tough kind of neighborhood. And it has confronted many challenges, many hardships, many tragedies over the years.
the flood being a major one. And, of course, flooding would have come as no surprise to Lucas Sullivan. He probably would have been amazed at the magnitude of the 13th flood. And then, of course, the Sandusky Expressway was another, I don't want to call it a tragedy, but it basically changed and transformed the whole character of the neighborhood and led to a certain decline.
Yeah.
So I think he would say, they persevered. And maybe a symbol for that perseverance I'm going to reference, because it's become one of my favorite spots to stop in Franklinton, is a coffee shop at Cypress and Broad called Bottoms Up.
Bottoms Up Coffee.
Bottoms Up.
One of my faves.
Okay. On the side of that is a mural of the two houses that were tipped over at Cypress during the flood. Okay.
Yeah.
And, it's been bottoms up now, because you see, businesses, small businesses starting to grow. You're starting to see a revival. And so I think that they would be happy with some of the things that were happening. I think I would like to think that they would hope that it would just be a really solid, good, middle-class neighborhood.
Yeah.
Where, residential has a strong residential character, small businesses, a thriving and energetic community.
And that's what we want. So I'm glad that you think they would want the same thing. Doreen, what kind of thoughts do you have about that?
Well, playing off something Peter said, I think it's resiliency.
Yeah.
And I think Sarah and Lucas would feel good that they had sons who, William went on to Yale, came back as a botanist for quite a while. Columbus was really the center of the East Coast scientists because of others that were here, that he even helped bring here, Leo Lequeux, others who were he was in touch with. And so this whole idea that the west side is also the beginning of the Great Plains botanically was because of Sullivan. Ohio State, the Ohio History Connection, the Old Ohio Historical Society, all of that were legacies of that second generation. And I'd like to think that there'll always be places for working class people and for people looking for home. There is that, when you mentioned Bottoms Up Coffee Shop, I think of the work they do with collecting diapers.
The diaper fund, yeah.
And that
since day one they've done that.
That is such a mark of what you find among the people who can still afford to be here. And I think that's what's important. But on another note, I will forward you this in case you're curious.
Okay.
There was a time in the 1871 when there were a lot of resentment about people, the have-nots in Franklin, who did not contribute to essentially giving Lucas claims they had on either side of the river. They kept having to up the ante to the Ohio legislature to sell the idea of Columbus. Uh-huh. And so they were left out of the windfall of all of that sales of land.
Right.
And so there was a blowback in Columbus, and they started to consider Franklinton as Sodom, as in Sodom and Gomorrah, with a lot of back description. So if you ever need a new branding, as your taverns grow, you can always bet your bottom dollar that you could use Sodom as a possible branding technique.
Okay, all right. Well, you guys have been a complete joy to talk to. I want to thank Mike Cash and Josh Clark with Jim Fia Productions. I want to thank Land Grant for hosting us here at their lively and energetic space. And I want to thank Doreen Uhas Saur and Peter Coccia for your stories and your interest in helping us record this information. And I also want to let everyone know that, as a reminder, what this is all about. This is about Franklintennial. And so this is the logo. This was actually an original screen print done by Franklinton Press, who's right there on West Broad Street. And they made these for businesses to display. And so if you're watching this and you're interested in one, you can get a hold of us. But you're going to see a lot of logo branding with this on it as we go throughout the year, because this is a year-long celebration to celebrate the 225th birthday of this fantastic neighborhood. So with that, again, thank you to our guests.
Real quick.
And yes, Peter.
And if I'm hoping Opera Columbus and Pro Musica Chamber Orchestra will stage this production of The Flood.
They may restage it.
Again.
Okay.
Be sure to see it. because it's just a wonderful, wonderful.
It was very well done. I was thoroughly impressed that an opera came out of the Franklinton flood story.
Isn't that great?
Very,
Yeah.
very,
Thank
very,
you for
very
inviting
interesting.
us.
Alrighty,
Thank
you guys have a great weekend, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.